Hi, Jonathan. We're back.
Great. Glad you joined us.
We are pushing through on our video training series here, and we have been on this topic, which is our topic of, what is it now?
Christmanship.
Integrating faith and sport.
Right.
And we are helping both the sports person who is trying to figure out how to do that on an individual basis, and also local churches around the world, whether they're being sports is used to plant churches or to grow churches. How do we actually conceptualize things theologically and philosophically? And so Jonathan and I, here's some contact information if you'd like to get involved, but you just need to know that this is the 7th topic, and this is our 4th session in this 7th topic, and there's many more. You can get that contact information there. Now, last time we talked about biblical sport. How do you do sport biblically in some ways, which is different than biblically defensible sport. We're trying to explain that as we go here. Biblically defensible sport, Jonathan, has to do with, are there certain sports that people that are Christians should not be involved in? And we just have to be honest and ask that kind of question. And here is 3 basics of whether they fit or not. Now, people are going to go immediately to the right side of the graph because there's only one. But I think in order to help explain that, we have to explain why some definitely do and why some may or may not, and then why one, in my opinion at this point, would right now not. Meeting the biblically based sports. The BBTS is biblically based template for sports. These are sports that raise the least amount of objectionable issues. Some of them may not really raise many at all. And you have to go back to our last session where we talked about, in order to meet the standard, there has to be a redemptive purpose. There has to be rules that govern this sport that are equitable, that are not intentionally harming the human body, the temple of the Holy Spirit. They're not endangering people in any way and unduly in the physical realm, but certainly not even in the emotional, relational, psychological realms. And these sports on the left typically are pretty good at meeting those kinds of things. But depending upon how the rules are conceived of, how the rules are enforced and officiated, how the rules are coached and taught and managed, how the rules are actually played out, they may move into borderline. Actually, all of these sports can slip off into the right side of the graph. Mm-hmm. But this is generally speaking where they are. So the middle ones have to do with how they are moving in directions of A, physicality. We showed the physicality graph last session. B, how they're dealing with the reward side of it, finance, how money plays into this, and also Lord's Day issues. And we need to understand that those are some of our basic problems when we start to think about what is biblically a good sport or not. So, as you can see, prize fighting, the reason that it's called prize fighting, as opposed to a fighting sport that's borderline, is because it adds the dimension of money being the ultimate goal, and the ultimate way that you earn money is to physically knock out a person, which is different than an Olympic-style boxing that are scored points by placing a fist on a chest in safe areas. It's kind of that you're not allowed to hit above the neck or below the waist. At least that's how I understand it. And so that's what would make the difference between boxing in an Olympic style and prize fighting. The purpose is not redemptive in prize fighting.
Now, what about all these martial arts that some of them have a purpose that is redemptive, and some of them you actually have to get in tune with some kind of other spirituality or something like that. How would you draw the line there?
Martial arts, as opposed to the what's it called, the MMA and all that we're
mixed
seeing.
fighting.
The martial arts, and this also would apply to a local church sports ministry in terms of people that are doing yoga and other kinds of things. These sports that have a basis in other religions and other faith bases would not be compatible with a Christian, biblically based sport.
Now, not all martial arts, though, are. So, for example, when I was running sports ministry, we actually had Taekwondo classes. And we would start each session with a devotional. We brought that into our program because it taught discipline, it taught respect. It was physically demanding. So all those things, and we used it for a redemptive purpose and brought in redemptive elements that allowed us to be able to say, hey, that's okay, we can use Taekwondo.
And this goes back to our first session in the 7th topic, that we talked about that theological template, and we said that it's created good, but then because of the fall, the sin entering into the human existence, that then it becomes a problem. And that's where then we said the third phase, if you can go back and look at that, or you remember that the third phase now of that is redemption. How do we actually redeem the sport? How can we bring it up to a standard and do it in such a way that it will be Christ honoring?
Right.
And
basically draws people to Christ.
Yes.
In other words, yeah.
And if you remember, we talked a little bit in our last topic about the Celtic way of evangelism. This is exactly what we learned from our Celtic evangelists of centuries ago, that they went into Celtic experience and Celtic culture, and they redeemed a lot of that. And that's our model for today. Yes, so I think that some of those things, like you said, can be redeemed. It's the same as we talked about with fencing and swordplay. One can kill and maim, it's not biblically defensible, but the other is a sport, and if we change the rules, we change the purpose, it can be. And so for these kinds of martial arts, I think they can be redeemed. I think that they should be redeemed, but that we need to take out all the other parts of it.
Yeah.
The model would be Moses. And God said to Moses, this would be a person in the Old Testament that was chosen by God to lead the Israelite slaves out of Egypt. This is a historical person that we're talking about. And he said to Moses, throw down your staff. Now his staff was how he did everything in life. He was a shepherd, he did everything with the staff. It protected him, it led him, it gave him status. And when he threw it down, it turned into a serpent. And God was saying, the way that you're using this is full of the enemy, the symbol of Satan. And he's asking us in these areas of Taekwondo and others to throw it down, let him then put his Holy Spirit into it. Then we can pick it up, and now it's full of God's power.
Great.
So I think that these are some of the things that are great. It's a great question. You have other questions? Other thoughts?
Yeah, another thought was, at some level, don't we have to redefine our definition of winning and losing and how it relates to the Bible? Because I know in the world, of course, winning and losing often has to do with the scoreboard. So if I win on the scoreboard, then I'm the winner. But maybe I've given 100%, and that's all I can give, and the team that I'm playing or the person that I'm up against is actually better than me. And so I can, if I go by what the world says as a definition of winning, then I feel defeated, and I feel like I've failed. When in reality, that's all I can give, and that's all that God asked me to give. And so, at what level do you sometimes change your definition of winning and losing? A perfect example: I was running a soccer league, and we had 8 teams in our league. This was for kids probably 8 to 10 years old, and one team that we put together, they were inferior to all the other teams. Now, we tried our best to balance a team, but there were a lot of things that happened that caused this team to have inferior talent. So what the coach did is, instead of necessarily keeping the score, because his team never won, they got 1 shot on goal the whole season, and that was in the first game. Mm-hmm. So what he did is he said, I'm going to change my perspective on winning and losing for the sake of my kids, so they can still learn and make this a positive experience. So he started keeping track of how many times the ball crossed the mid-court line or the midfield line. And so every game they were trying to outdo the previous game by just getting the ball across the midfield line. And so he allowed that situation to become redemptive in such a way that, of course, already we know soccer is we believe in most cases a biblically defensible sport, so that's not the issue. But the point is that sometimes within these sports, even, we have to redefine winning and losing in order to make them the kind of environment or the sport that I think God intended in order to make it a positive experience for the kids. Now, the parents came up to the coach afterwards and they said, we don't want to go through another season like this again. This was good for one time to teach our kids. But it helped in dealing with the situation that gave them a real positive experience.
Well, you're exactly right. And you're very astute on this, Jonathan, as always. And we're, as we talk about in the next session about Christmanship, mm-hmm. as opposed to sportsmanship or gamesmanship, we start to really understand this from a perspective. But you're exactly right. It's why we call it overwhelming victory. Not just a victory, but overwhelming victory. And that doesn't have to do with the score. It has to do with the overwhelmingness of pleasing Christ and glorifying Christ, honoring Christ in what we do.
Well, and that's significant in how we make our sport, I think, defensible.
That's right.
Biblically. Because as you say, even if it's a biblically defensible sport, if our motives are wrong,
or our approach is wrong,
then it goes to the other side, and that's just as bad as trying to use a sport that is not biblically defensible.
Right. And as we mentioned in the last session, just because somebody has a sport that meets all those steps,
right,
and so it's biblically defensible, they can still be biblically indefensible as an individual participant in that sport.
Right.
And so it's one thing to say that the sports are, and another thing to say the sports person is. And there's, in terms of what you see on the screen, and you see in terms of do we make the standard or not, I'll make a blanket statement. All sports that I'm aware of can be biblically defensible if the way they are approached follow what we talked about in the last session. And when they cannot, any sport can become biblically indefensible.
That's a powerful statement.
And so
I believe you. I agree. 100%.
And so it is how we envision them, how we manage them, how we play them, how we spectate them, all of that.
So it really comes back to you as the sports leader, or the person now who's asking, how can I use sports in my own church? It's up to you whether you're going to make it biblically defensible or not.
One of the ones that causes people oftentimes great grief is this Lord's Day in sport, which is a topic that we don't have time to deal with right now, but obviously I've written about it, and there's many things about this that need to be considered. I will just say this, that I have never said, nor will I believe that I will say, that we cannot participate in a sport on the Lord's Day. But there are some things we need to take in consideration, very deep consideration. And it comes back to what you just said, our motivation, etc., and our prioritization. And if you want to get more on that, I know that I hope to do another training series on that, and also there is a chapter in the book. And you
have the book.
Jumping ahead just a little bit, thank you for that. But Jonathan, this graph that we have up now is really where we're going to start to focus on. Because what we've seen is that when faith and sport things, like Lord's Day, like prize fighting, when these things come in conflict, we see that there are 4 classical reactions that sports people of faith move into. They move into a capitulation of their faith, an accommodation of their faith, a rejection of sport, or a redemptive mode within sport. And these 4 classical responses we can actually kind of chart and understand historically. And so this is where we're going. We're going to help people understand how we can not only do this as individuals, but how a local church sports ministry can do this and help their individuals understand how they end up in one of these 4 quadrants. Mm-hmm. It's kind of what we call it's what we call our Christmanship ethic.
Great.
So you've heard about the book. This is how you can get in touch with us.
Great.
And we're going here next time about Christmanship, competing in the image of Christ, and how do we actually do that.
Great.
So Jonathan, again, we really appreciate from the CSRM perspective.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks, Greg, for your wisdom and input. It's really good stuff.
All right, see you next time.
Yep.